Before the sun even rose, Sarah Miller was already awake. The small apartment was quiet. An old kettle slowly boiled on the stove, and outside the window the city was just beginning to wake up. Sarah gently opened the door to a small bedroom. On the narrow bed slept her son, Noah. He was only 10 years old. He slept hugging a worn-out teddy bear Sarah had given him years ago. She carefully pulled the blanket over him. "Sleep well, my sweet boy," she whispered. Every time Sarah looked at him, she felt the same thought in her heart. He deserved a better life than the one she could give him. But she was trying her best. Sarah quickly put on her old coat, the same one she had worn for several winters, and quietly left the apartment. She always left early so she could catch the cheapest bus. An hour later, she stood in front of a huge house. The house belonged to a wealthy couple, Richard and Victoria Collins. Tall gates, massive windows, marble stairs, luxury cars in the driveway. The house was bigger than the entire block where Sarah lived. But for her, it meant only one thing: a long day of hard work. As soon as she stepped inside, she grabbed a bucket and a cloth and started cleaning. She washed the floors in the enormous living room. She dusted expensive furniture. She cleaned the kitchen. She did the laundry. The house was so large that sometimes it felt like she was cleaning an entire hotel. And she did all of this for a very small salary. But Sarah never complained, because every dollar she earned meant something important: paying for Noah's school-buying notebooks, buying warm clothes for winter, or simply putting food on the table. Sometimes she returned home so exhausted she could barely stand. But the moment Noah opened the door and said, "Mom, you're home," all the tiredness seemed to disappear. She always smiled at him, even when things were very hard. The owner of the house, Richard Collins, almost never looked at her. He walked past her as if she were part of the furniture. Sometimes he didn't even say hello, and sometimes he said coldly, "Sarah, you missed a spot." And she silently went back and cleaned the floor again. Not because she was afraid, but because she couldn't lose this job. She had to think about Noah. His life had not started easily. Several years earlier, Sarah and her husband Daniel had adopted Noah from an orphanage. They couldn't have children of their own, but the moment they saw the little boy, they both knew. He was meant to be their son. Daniel had said that day, "We will give him a real family." And they truly tried. But their happiness did not last long. Only a year after the adoption, Daniel suddenly passed away. From that moment, Sarah's life became much harder. She was alone. Alone with a small child. Alone with bills. Alone with fear for the future. Sometimes she had to work almost every day. Sometimes she saved money even on herself just to buy Noah a new pair of shoes. But she never regretted adopting him, because every evening, when Noah sat next to her and told her stories about school, she remembered something important. He was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Meanwhile, inside the huge Collins mansion, there was one thing that had never existed: the sound of a child's laughter. Richard and Victoria had no children. The house was full of expensive things, but strangely empty. Sometimes Sarah noticed Victoria standing by the window, watching children playing outside. In those moments there was sadness in her eyes, but Sarah had no idea that very soon her son would become part of this family's story, and that one day Richard Collins would make her an offer that would force her to choose between poverty and her own child. One cold morning, Sarah arrived at the Collins mansion earlier than usual. The house felt strangely quiet. She picked up her cleaning supplies and began working on the second floor. But suddenly, she heard a loud sound from downstairs. Something had fallen. Sarah froze. Then she quickly ran down the marble stairs. In the middle of the living room, Victoria Collins was lying on the floor. A broken glass lay beside her. "Mrs. Collins!" Sarah shouted. She rushed to her and immediately called an ambulance. Within minutes, the quiet mansion filled with doctors and paramedics. Victoria was taken to the hospital. For the first time since Sarah started working there, she saw Richard Collins look completely different. He wasn't cold. He wasn't arrogant. He looked lost. He sat on the sofa, holding his head in his hands while doctors spoke to him quietly in the hallway. Sarah accidentally overheard part of their conversation. "She has been living with this condition for a long time," the doctor said softly. "We warned you. The chances are very small." That evening, Sarah was cleaning the kitchen when Richard suddenly spoke. His voice sounded different, quiet, heavy. "Victoria always dreamed about having a child." Sarah stopped wiping the counter. "We tried for years," he continued, "but the doctors said it was impossible." The house felt painfully silent. When Sarah was about to leave for the day, Richard suddenly said something unexpected. "I saw your son once, when he came to pick you up." Sarah nodded slowly. "Noah is a good boy," Richard said. He looked toward the window. That day, Victoria watched him for a long time. He paused, and she said something I will never forget. Sarah felt a strange tension in the room. She said, "If she ever had a son, I would want him to be like that boy." Sarah didn't know what to say, but then Richard looked directly at her and said something she never expected. "Sarah, if something happens to Victoria, I want to fulfill her last wish." He paused. "I want to adopt Noah." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs, her son, her entire world, and suddenly the wealthy man who barely noticed her before was offering him a completely different life. But Sarah didn't know yet that this was only the beginning of the story. That night Sarah could barely sleep. Richard's words echoed in her mind again and again. "I want to adopt Noah." She looked at her son sleeping peacefully in the small bedroom. His school books were neatly stacked on the desk. Next to them was his old backpack. Noah dreamed of becoming a doctor someday, and Sarah had always feared one thing, that her poverty might break his dreams. The next day, Sarah returned to the Collins house. Richard was already waiting for her in his office. "Sit down, Sarah," he said calmly. "We need to talk." She sat nervously. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Several years ago," he began, "Victoria and I tried to adopt a child." Sarah listened carefully. "A little boy named Noah." Her heart skipped a beat. "We were almost ready to sign the papers," Richard continued. "Victoria had already prepared a room for him." He paused. "But the day before we finalized everything, we were told the boy had already been adopted." Sarah lowered her eyes. "That was you," Richard said. "You and your husband." Memories suddenly rushed into Sarah's mind. The orphanage, the frightened little boy, her husband Daniel smiling as he held Noah's tiny hand. "We'll give him a family," Daniel had said. Sarah's voice trembled. "My husband died a year later. Since then, it's just been me and Noah." Richard nodded slowly. "I know." He stood and walked toward the window. "That's exactly why I'm offering you something." Sarah felt a chill in her chest. "Victoria and I still want Noah to be our son." Sarah immediately shook her head. He already has a mother. Richard looked at her calmly. You're a good woman, Sarah. But let's be honest. You work 12 hours a day. You struggle to pay for his school. And this is only going to get harder. Sarah remained silent. We could give him a completely different life, Richard said. The best schools. Security. A future. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Money isn't everything, she whispered. Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then his expression turned cold. I will give you time to think. He walked back to his desk. But understand one thing, Sarah. If you refuse, I will fire you. Sarah felt her stomach drop, but Richard continued. And I will do everything possible to make sure Noah still ends up with us. She stared at him in shock. You can't do that. Richard gave a cold smile. In this city, money can do many things. The room felt heavy with silence. Think carefully, Sarah, he said. You can give your son a better life willingly, or lose both your job and your son. Sarah slowly left the office. Her heart was breaking. At home, her son Noah was waiting for her, the boy she once promised never to abandon. And now, a powerful man had forced her into an impossible choice: give up her child, or risk losing everything. That night, Sarah sat alone at the small kitchen table. The apartment was silent. A single lamp cast a weak yellow light across the room. On the table lay Noah's school bill and a few unpaid receipts. Sarah stared at them for a long time. Then she slowly stood up and walked into Noah's room. He was sleeping peacefully. His small hand rested on the old teddy bear he had loved since he was little. Sarah sat beside him and gently brushed his hair. For a moment, she simply watched him breathe. Then she whispered softly, No matter what happens, I will protect you. But deep inside, she was afraid. Very afraid. The next morning, Sarah returned to the Collins mansion. Richard was already waiting in the living room. He stood by the large window looking outside. Without turning around, he asked, Have you made your decision? Sarah took a deep breath. Yes. The room felt heavy. I will not give you my son. Richard slowly turned. For a moment he said nothing. Then a cold smile appeared on his face. I expected that. He calmly picked up a folder from the table. You see, Sarah, I prepared for this. Inside the folder were legal documents. I've already spoken with lawyers. Sarah felt her hands begin to shake. You adopted Noah years ago, Richard continued, but since your husband passed away, your financial situation has become unstable. Her heart began to race. My lawyers believe the court may reconsider his guardianship. You can't do that, Sarah whispered. Richard looked at her calmly. In this world, Sarah, money opens many doors. A few weeks later, Sarah stood in a courtroom. Her hands were trembling. Across the room sat Richard Collins with two expensive lawyers beside him. Everything happened too fast. Documents, arguments, cold legal words. And then, the judge spoke. The decision was made. Noah would live with Richard and Victoria Collins. Sarah felt the world collapse around her. That evening, Noah stood near the door of their small apartment. Two people from social services waited quietly behind him. Mom, what's happening? Noah asked softly. Sarah could barely breathe. She knelt down and hugged him as tightly as she could. I love you, she whispered. Never forget that. Noah held her tightly. Tears ran down his face. "I won't, Mom." Moments later, the door closed. The apartment became unbearably silent. Outside, a black luxury car slowly drove away. Inside the car, Noah looked out the window, and, far behind him, standing in the doorway of the old building, Sarah was still there, watching, unable to move. Years passed. Noah grew up in the Collins mansion. He studied at the best schools. He wore expensive clothes. He lived a life Sarah could never have given him. But there was one thing he never forgot: his mother. Richard never allowed Noah to see her. Every time he asked, the answer was always the same: no. But Noah remembered everything: her small apartment, her tired smile, the way she always said, "I'm proud of you." And deep inside, he made a promise to himself. One day, he would find her. 20 years later. A black car stopped in front of an old apartment building. The neighborhood looked worn and quiet. A tall young man stepped out of the car. It was Noah. He stood there for a moment, looking at the building. Then he slowly walked to the door and knocked. After a few seconds, the door opened. Sarah stood there, older, more tired, but the moment she saw him, she froze. Noah smiled gently. "Hi, Mom." Sarah's hands began to shake. "Noah!" He stepped forward and hugged her. And this time, no one could take him away. Tears ran down Sarah's face as she held her son again. "I knew you would come back," she whispered. Noah looked around the small apartment. Then he smiled. "You took care of me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." That day, Noah changed Sarah's life. He bought her a new home. He made sure she never had to struggle again. But the most important thing he gave her was something she had missed for many years: her son. And for the first time in a very long time, Sarah was no longer alone.